Anyway, as Laura said, my name is Carol, and I come from a traditional background in nutritional sciences and have been working in the area of brain health for, gosh, probably about 30 years now in terms of my appointment at the university and at Baycrest. Much of what I'm going to be talking about really comes from a focus on prevention, although I'll start by saying that what we know from a preventative perspective, we also believe will be helpful in terms of helping slow down the progression. We probably have more scientific evidence as it relates to prevention, but emerging studies in terms of looking at slowing down the progression. Before I start, I just always like to acknowledge the fact that research involves large teams, and I have a large number of people that I have worked with in the past and am working in the future, and I'll be using the collective royal we when I talk about the work, and it really represents the work from a host of us, and of course thanking the Canadian Institute of Health Research in terms of supporting financially the research studies that we do. The starting point, I think, in terms of where we have changed a lot of our thinking really has to do with trying to get an understanding of the role of genetics versus the role of our lifestyles in terms of predicting our risk for Alzheimer's disease. And while I'll say Alzheimer's disease probably includes dementias, particularly like the vascular dementia. But the sobering fact is that it's now felt that about 60% of Alzheimer's diagnoses are attributed to poor lifestyle. And that clearly I'm coming from the interest in terms of looking at the role of poor eating habits. But we also, sort of through our collective, are interested in the lack of physical and intellectual stimulation. Recognizing that these are very strong drivers for dementia and probably stronger than genetics alone. And I think that we see this as a real good news piece in that the more that we understand how lifestyle impacts our risk for dementia and also can impact the rate at which we would have progression, is that it really does give us an opportunity to make real difference rather than kind of sit passively around the whole issue. This has really led to a host of studies and interest in the scientific community around identifying factors that could help reduce the risk for dementia, or as I say, slow down the progression, and has kind of evolved into what we call a brain fitness movement. And the real question is how much of it is hype and how much of it is hope, and do we have any real evidence that these things can be beneficial? And so where we come from is that our goal, no matter where people are, is to try and build as much as possible what we call cognitive reserve, so help build capacity, and then look at what we need to do in order to maintain that capacity as we age, and even as we age healthily or in the context of having a neurodegenerative disorder. And I like to put this in the context, and I think women are particularly sensitive to this, is that it's the same as, in my mind, as osteoporosis. We have all kind of been told that when we're in our teens and our early 20s, it's the time that we want to try to build as much bone strength as we can, and that while we know we're going to lose bone after we go through the menopause, that one is you want to start with a heavy mass, and that two is that even in the postmenopausal periods, you're wanting to make certain that you're exercising and doing things to help retain that bone strength. We now know that we can apply exactly those same models in terms of looking at what we need to do in terms of trying to build and sustain our brain capacity, both in terms of our size of the brain, but also to enable our brain to carry out its normal functions. We have a whole host of factors that we know are very important in terms of the brain reserve. The ones that I have over here are really ones that there's very little that we can do about by the time we're in middle age and older. Males have lower Alzheimer's disease risk. We can't do much about our genetics, and we're already beyond the age where we can be doing things like furthering, well, education we can always further, but the education that we had in youth, learning new language or being bilingual from the time that we were born, or the types of occupations that we were involved in before we retired. But this is the list where we all really have the capacity in terms of being able to continue to participate to the best of our extent, and that by participating in these types of activities that we are stimulating this brain reserve, and we're helping ourselves maintain that reserve as much as possible. So we've got things like our physical and mental health, which is really just making certain that you're taking care of other parts of your health as we go through. I'll talk a lot more about exercise as we go through, but we know that physical activity is extremely important. We have people at Baycrest that are actually studying the role of being a volunteer on the argument that people that are volunteering are keeping themselves engaged, they're socially engaged, they're having to exercise in terms of playing their volunteer roles, and even being a volunteer in and of itself seems to be beneficial. I know that Laura was saying that she has her own interest in terms of keeping people socially and cognitively engaged in terms of helping to sustain this brain capacity. And then certainly we have the development of a number of different memory strategies that people can use, both in terms of learning how to make linkages to help remember names, through to using iPads and various other types of technologies to help people get cued when they require it. What's very interesting, I think, is when we look in terms of this brain capacity, brain reserve perspective, is that we're really identifying the same factors that the Alzheimer's Society of Canada promotes in terms of successful brain aging. So we can see that the things that they're promoting are healthy food choices, being physically active, keeping yourself socially engaged, keeping and stimulating your brain as much as you possibly can, taking charge of your health. And here we're going to say particularly in terms of things like your blood pressure and your blood glucose, stress reduction, often a lot easier said than done, but making certain that you have time out for yourself in the day in order to be able to relieve your stress, whether that's practicing Tai Chi or meditation or having a cup of tea or whatever it is that you're going to do to make certain that you are giving yourself that time out. And then finally, the serious about your safety is really targeted in terms of trying to do the best that you can to avoid any kind of brain injury. So where we think most of it in terms of people of our age group is making certain that you're wearing your seatbelt. Obviously for your children and grandchildren, you're wanting to make certain that they're wearing their helmets, particularly if they play any kind of contact sport. So when we look at the diet issue, it really, I think, is depicted well in this particular slide, is that in many ways we are looking at the adverse health effect of the increasing prevalence of obesity in our population. And the reason that I'm saying that is that we all know inherently that, that obesity, heart disease, high blood cholesterol, high blood pressure, and diabetes are chronic diseases that have a major diet connection. And actually they have a major diet and physical activity connection. And that's something that's just part of our core knowledge. But I think what we haven't done very well is communicate the fact that these are also risk factors for accelerated loss of cognitive function with aging and dementia. So it's saying that if you have a background in terms of having high cholesterol, having high blood pressure, having type 2 diabetes, that it's hugely important that you're doing what you can to try and manage those disorders as a way in terms of trying to provide a more gentle, more conducive environment in terms of the brain. given that background and knowing that those obesity-associated disorders are associated with accelerated loss of cognitive function, it's not surprising then that when we start to look at the nutrition literature, that traditional high-fat, low-fiber, low-fruit and vegetable North American diet is not good for our brains. And we have lots of evidence both from human studies, from animal experiments where we're looking at mechanism to really substantiate that. Some of it is going to be as simple as the fact that we know that the traditional diet that probably you and I all grew up on is ones that promote obesity and promote the high blood pressures and the high cholesterols and the type 2 diabetes. But we also know that there are probably other certain specific aspects of it that are not good for brain health. We also know then that as we start to look at when is the brain starting to be impacted by our lifestyle, and particularly from a dietary perspective, that the health that we're bringing into our retirement is going to be tremendously important. So when we look at the obesity issue, it's not a problem if people are obese in their 70s. It's more of a problem for individuals that were obese in their late middle adulthood, I'll call it, in their 50s and early 60s, because we know that midlife diet and central adiposity increases dementia risk, and that it seems to do that over and above the effect of diabetes and various cardiovascular, cholesterol, high blood pressure issues. So our health really, when we have to start thinking of what do I need to implement as you're talking in terms of children and grandchildren, is to recognize that when we reach into our 50s is really the time where we have to start really being attuned to our lifestyle as it relates to our brain health, and that we have to then maintain those lifestyle choices as we move through aging. So never too late to start, engage your children, but I'm also going to go on to argue that it is never too late to start, and we have optimistic evidence that we should be able to have benefits even in older adults. So here's generally what we think of the picture of being, and I argue that brain aging doesn't start when we're 65. My brain started to age when I left my mother's womb, and we now know that there are aspects that are happening even in the womb that are going to be important in terms of how our brain ages. But what we can argue is that a lot of the pathological events that we see, that we think of as being hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease, what we call those plaques and tangles, are actually starting to develop in our 30s and 40s. It may be that we don't diagnose people in terms of actually having cognitive impairments until they, sort of into late 50s, early 60s, and then that increases in terms of diagnosis as the percentage of the population as people age. But this is a disorder that has a long, chronic sort of aspect to it, and that's probably why the more and the earlier we adopt those healthy lifestyles in our 40s and 50s, the more likely we're hitting at a time where we're able to modify some of the changes that are occurring, that are going on, and that while we still have evidence that we can modify when people are into this, what we call symptomatic, already having a diagnosis area, that the best is trying to do it younger. We're also, I'm going to bring up as we talk what we call here in terms of MCI, and that's just an abbreviation that we use for what we call mild cognitive impairment. And this is kind of a middle zone for individuals where we already know that cognitively they're performing lower than we would expect for their age, but they haven't yet hit the hallmark in terms of having a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. So much the same way that we talk about people being pre-diabetic and then the pre-diabetic going on to develop diabetes, that we think of this mild cognitive impairment phase as kind of being a pre-dementia phase. And so clearly trying to look at how people transition from mild cognitive impairment into a dementia diagnosis is something that is very hot in terms of areas of research, and how then we slow down the progression both in the transition but then also at this early stage in terms of diagnosis. So what I'm saying is that our bad eating habits, our bad lifestyle choices can contribute to our risk of dementia, and that that's kind of the downside of the story. So can we flip this in terms of being an up and more optimistic discussion in terms of helping empower individuals in terms of what do they need to do in order to be able to overcome some of the adverse effects of lifestyle choices, and what is the evidence that we have that it could still be beneficial. So from the diet perspective, where we have the most robust evidence is what we call individuals that are eating what we call a Mediterranean style diet. And I'll get to what that is in 2 seconds. But a meta-analysis is just a term where we use where people look at a whole variety of different studies in the literature that are similar and try to pull them together in terms of looking at what we can say across all of the different studies. So what do we know about the Mediterranean diet? Well, if in cognitively normal individuals, we know that starting there that higher adherence is associated with a 27% lower risk for MCI, this prodromal early stage, and a 36% lower risk for Alzheimer's disease. So we're talking about over a 30% reduction in Alzheimer's disease risk simply associated with eating a healthier diet. I'll also tell you that there are similar studies which look specifically at individuals that already have a diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment, and it shows that those individuals who consume more of a Mediterranean style diet transition into Alzheimer's disease at a much slower rate. So it seems to be beneficial across all of those various areas in terms of our health. The other point that I think is really important here is that in this meta-analysis, which I say is a collective across many different studies, is there's a Nikos Eremias who studies the Mediterranean style diet. And what I think is really important about his work is he's actually studying a group of older adults who are living in New York City. And they're actually living in a not very wealthy suburb. So that whatever he's seen in terms of the benefits of this Mediterranean style diet have nothing to do with living on a Greek island and looking out at the Mediterranean, because he's taking people in a very rough urban environment and showing benefits with it. So what I have here is a picture of what we traditionally think of in terms of a Mediterranean style eating. You can see that it's a diet that's really grounded in fruits and vegetables and whole grains. So here on the bread, looking at lots of fish. The next sort of layer in terms of your proteins are coming from things like eggs and cheese and chicken, and that your meats, and particularly your red meats, while you don't have to abstain, are really only treat foods. So not looking at eating red meat every day, looking at eating red meat maybe once a month. So you can still have it, reserve it for a treat, and make sure that you're drawing more of your proteins out of your chicken, eggs, cheese, and fish. So that's kind of the grounding of what we consider the Mediterranean style diet. So why is this Mediterranean style eating so important? And what kind of evidence do we have that it's helping to protect our brain? Well, first of all, in individuals that are eating more in a Mediterranean style diet, they actually have like larger total brain volumes. So we understand that as we age, we start to get loss of brain cells, and we call that loss atrophy. And that clearly we have an age-related atrophy, and then we have more atrophy that is going to occur if people have a neurodegenerative disorder. So that it's helping protect against this atrophy with the healthier style eating. It's also helping to protect against developing what we call white matter hyperintensities. And what that is the, you can imagine, this is the terminology comes from when we look at a brain scan. We actually see these little pinholes of white that are coming through on the scan. And that's almost really what they're evidence of, these tiny little holes that are occurring in the brain. And that what we think that is associated with, and particularly in people with high blood pressure, is that the capillaries in our blood vessels will break. They're more likely to break the higher our blood pressure, and we're more likely to have those breaks the older we have. But the more of these white matter hyperintensities that we're developing, it's going to be associated with poorer cognitive performance. We're going to lower those white matter hyperintensities through healthy eating. A piece of that is going to be through managing our blood pressure. And then finally, we often talk about the environment that allows the neurodegenerative process to not only to be started, but also to progress. And that if you have a high level of oxidative stress or an inflammatory state in the brain, that we know that the diseases are going to occur more rapidly, particularly things like Alzheimer's disease. So what we're wanting to do is lower our oxidative stress in our inflammation, and that should actually have a healthier environment in terms of the aging of the brain, and that we see, at least from blood markers of individuals on the Mediterranean style diet, that they actually do have lower levels of oxidation and inflammation. So when we start to look at the disease processes that are occurring as a natural consequence of aging, or are escalated in the context of a neurodegenerative disorder, that we can see that eating more like a Mediterranean style diet is actually helping protect against the types of things that we figure that we have to lower. However, and this is a big however, that I don't know how many times I speak and talk about eating a Mediterranean style diet, and the very first thing people sort of do is they look up and they say, I didn't think pizza was healthy. A Mediterranean style diet does not mean eating or concentrating on Italian, Greek, or Spanish foods. What it refers to is any diet that's rich in fruits, vegetables, whole grains and cereals, beans and pulses, and fish. And I think particularly living in a multicultural environment, that this is really important, because what it's telling us is that there's many ways that we can achieve a brain healthy diet. We can still enjoy sort of the tastes and flavors and textures of foods from different cultures, be it Asian or more traditional Canadian cooking, as long as we're relying on the principles of increasing our intakes of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, and fishes, and avoiding the red meats, avoiding highly processed foods. So it's kind of going back to that more natural style of eating. So the real question, and I think the one that's important, is it too late for me? I'm saying that you're best to be targeting your children and your grandchildren and promoting healthy living to them, but what can we do for ourselves? And do we have any evidence that if we change our eating patterns later in life, that it's going to be beneficial? Fortunately, I wouldn't be asking the question unless I was going to tell you that there is good evidence, and that there's been this hugely important study that has come out of Spain. They've called themselves the PREDIMED study, and what they did is they brought in people that had a number of risk factors for heart disease, but didn't actually have heart disease at the time that they came in. Look at the age of the people that started. They started when they were 55 to 80 years of age. So we're talking about intervening in older adults. The study was enormous. It was over 7,000 people. And they effectively had 3 different treatment groups that they were looking at. So one group sort of went on what we call that traditional low-fat diet, and for any of you that have high cholesterol, it's probably what your physician would be advising you to do. The other 2 groups were asked to eat this Mediterranean-style diet. One group got extra olive oil, and one group got extra nuts. And here they were just interested in terms of looking at some of the fat issues around it. And I'll tell you right from the beginning that they didn't see any difference between the groups that were receiving the olive oil or the nuts, but they did see a benefit of the Mediterranean diet. If we look in terms of some of the major outcomes, that there was close to a 30% reduction in terms of people having major cardiovascular events, things like heart attacks, if they were consuming the Mediterranean diet relative to the low-fat diet. But look at this tremendous reduction in risk of stroke. People actually had a 40% lower risk of having stroke if they were consuming the Mediterranean diet versus the low-fat. This particular study was stopped after close to 5 years, and the reason that it was stopped is that the people that were overseeing and evaluating the results felt that the data was so strong and so robust that it was no longer ethical to keep people on the low-fat diet. So it was not stopped because there was any kind of adverse events. It was stopped because they say, we had all of the evidence we need. Let's get the people on the low-fat diet and transition them into the Mediterranean. The PREDIMED itself actually was associated, obviously it's predominantly a heart disease study, but they did go on to look at cognitive function. Excuse me. And so for here, they were capturing, they looked at people that were at high vascular risk, so really interested in what we call these vascular dementias. They had just over 500 people. And here, look at the average age of the participants, 75 years of age. And looking then at individuals that were placed on either this low-fat diet or one of the 2 Mediterranean-style diets. And then measured their cognition 6.5 years after they started the intervention. So the 2 cognitive tests that they used is the MMSE is the mini mental state examination. It's one that we often use in terms of the first step in terms of a dementia screen, and that individuals that were consuming the Mediterranean style diet had higher mini mental state examination scores relative to those on the low-fat diet. And we saw similar benefits. They saw similar benefits on something called the clock drawing test. And for those of you that are in Ontario, you know that this is going to be a new part of your driving license renewal, is you're going to have to be doing the clock drawing test. And really what you're asked to do is draw the face of a clock. And again, the individuals on the Mediterranean style diet were actually getting higher scores doing the clock drawing test better than those individuals on the low-fat diet. So I think where we are is that we have a wealth of information. It comes both from what we call epidemiologic studies, which is just really getting information of people aging in place and getting information in terms of what they're doing from a diet and lifestyle perspective, as well as from having people change their diet. And both of those types of evidence are telling us that this Mediterranean high fruit, vegetable, grains, fish diet is associating with better health. It's associated with better health in older adults, and it seems to be associated with slower progression, particularly if we look at the progression from a mild cognitive impairment into an overt dementia. That is the context of where we have the bulk of information. But unfortunately, I think what we have is a lot of misinformation that's coming across from people. We have a lot of unsubstantiated claims. And so, unfortunately, you folks are sort of in the situation where you're really having to wade through and try to get a sense of what is substantiated, what should I be doing, and what should I not even be bothering with in terms of, you know, looking in terms of what's there. Well, I think that one of the things that we recognize is that there's not a magic bullet, there's not a quick fix, and there's not a single nutrient that's going to benefit the brain. And the reason for that is that if we look in terms of what do we need to do in terms of maintaining brain health, well, one of the things is clearly we have to keep the health of our blood vessels so that the blood and the oxygen and the nutrients are being delivered to the brain. As we were saying before, we have to do things to lower that oxidative stress. We have to lower any kind of inflammation that could be there. And then we just have to provide core nutrients to the brain to allow it to function. And that when we start to look at that collective of what we need to do, there's no one single nutrient that does all of that. We need the blend of nutrients. We need the mix of nutrients across a healthy diet. So one of the things that I think that we see happening is that at a science level, we're often interested in terms of looking at a healthy diet and trying to identify what we call the bioactive compounds or the healthy components of food that seem to be involved in what we call neuroprotection in terms of protecting the brain. And so that we're going to take maybe a tomato and we're going to isolate individual ingredients and try to find out what are the components of the tomato that seem to be beneficial. Well, with that discovery now, rather than using that information to inform public health policy and encourage greater consumption of fruits and vegetables in the Canadian population, what we're seeing is that those isolated ingredients are either being marketed in pill form or put into what we would call a less than healthy diet. And that I will always argue that adding essence of broccoli is not going to make burgers and fries a healthy meal. And we know that, but somehow or another we want to get pulled into that hype because it seems like an easy answer. Well, I will tell you that we do have a major problem with that approach. There have been many, many, many clinical trials that have looked at using supplements. So whether the supplements have been individual vitamins or minerals, individual components for foods, mixtures that would have antioxidants, things like folate and vitamin B12 and fish oils, that the only consistent result that we have is that all of the supplement trials have failed. We have failed to see improvement in terms of cognitive performance in individuals after they have been taking the supplements. The one caveat here is that the evidence is getting stronger and stronger for fish oils, and there's no question that people that are interested in terms of trying to prolong their brain health as long as possible, making certain that you're either consuming fish, fatty fish, or getting those omega-3 fatty acids from other foods is a hugely important part of it. Nevertheless, I think as you start to look at this evolution of what's happening and how science discovery is being translated to the general public, and then how general public is taking it up, is that we're starting to see sort of people ping-ponging all over. And I don't know how many times I would be being asked whether or not a single food is healthy and healthy for the brain. So I kind of try to depict that in terms of saying that we're, you know, just heading into our spring. I don't know if those of you out in Victoria are already starting to see your berries ripen. We're just looking forward to our strawberries cutting ground at this point. But, you know, we come to this period where we just have this beautiful, you know, sort of sun-ripened local fruit available to us. But you've all been told that blueberries are healthy, and rather than picking up that strawberry, you end up going to the freezer section of the grocery store and buying frozen blueberries because you're thinking that you should be eating blueberries. And then we go beyond raspberry season, or beyond strawberries, or raspberries start to come out, still doing the same thing in terms of purchasing. And then finally we hit the fall, our blueberries are finally ready, and in the meantime you've heard on the media that pomegranates are healthy, and you don't buy the blueberries, you go after the pomegranates. And then finally you go to buy the pomegranate, and somebody says that there was a recent report out that white fruit, and particularly pears and apples, are associated with lower risk of stroke. And I think that this is kind of the bombardment that people are being faced with, and trying to make consciously healthy decisions and feeling that they don't know what to do when they go into the grocery store, when the bottom line is fruits and vegetables are healthy. We don't have evidence that any one fruit or vegetable is healthier than another. And what you should be doing is putting as much fruit and vegetable into your shopping tray as you want. And I will always argue that the most healthy ones that you'll eat, as opposed to the ones that rot in your refrigerator throughout the week. So that we continue to hear this term superfood in terms of trying to be driven in terms of purchasing various things. And I will say that we have no in terms of what we're studying has more benefit from another. You need to understand that when we do these types of studies in our laboratories, that we can only study one food at a time. So I may have done a study on blueberries. I'm going to tell you all about the benefits that I saw on blueberries, but I can't comment in terms of whether or not the blueberry is healthier than the strawberry or the raspberry, because I haven't studied it. So that if that context is not being communicated well, people end up with the false impression that blueberries are good food, when really what it's saying is that berries are very good for you. When we look at how we study nutrition at these population levels, we study at the level of food groups, fruits, vegetables, grains, poultry. We don't study at the level of individual foods. That when we come back to that principle in terms of saying the brain needs a whole host of different nutrients in order to be able to retain its function, that at the bottom line is that variety is the best way to ensure that exposure. So rather than concentrating on always having one or two fruits and vegetables, exploring, pushing your boundaries in terms of variety is the best thing that you can do. And again, coming back to that caveat is the fatty fish, things like the salmon, sardines, and mackerel, fabulous in terms of the brain, recognizing that some people are not fish eaters, and we have lots of opportunity in terms of buying omega-3 fortified foods in our grocery stores these days. The other problem that you're combating, I think, when we start to look at this particular area is the type, as kind of goes on to that same argument, the types of messaging that we're giving consumers. And that this is just some work that was done from a colleague of mine at University of Toronto. And what she was looking at is we are now allowed to put nutrition-related information on what they call the front of pack, so that it's information that you see as you're pulling something off the shelves in the grocery stores. And she had looked at a whole host of different types of claims that foods will carry, anything from being low in cholesterol, having whole grain, sodium reduced, caffeine free. We've all seen all of these different claims. And then she was looking at the types of foods that were carrying those claims. Well, 41% of foods that carried claims were foods that we're told we shouldn't be eating. And we all know that tacos and potato chips aren't something that we should be including a lot of in our diet, yet these are the types of foods that are giving us health-related information. So the healthy foods, you see very little health-related information in your fresh produce in the grocery store, and that where you're getting driven to purchase foods aren't things that Health Canada is telling us to eat as few of in our diet. So we have a mismatch between where we're getting the health-related information being communicated on foods and the types of foods that you should be choosing in terms of maintaining your brain health. So somehow or another, we have to learn how to go back to the real simple message, learn to make it exciting, acceptable, and productive, and figure out how to enable people to make very simple changes to their diet. Without doubt, managing your cholesterol, blood pressure, and reducing your diabetes risk is going to be tremendously important. As we started, we were saying that that all of these are risk factors for dementia, and all of these, having them in the background, has the potential that the dementia will progress more rapidly. So maintaining that health with your family physician, hugely important. I can't emphasize more that as Canadians, we need to eat more fruits and vegetables. We're way below the levels that we would like to see people achieve. And that's probably the best thing that you could do for yourself after we get off the webinar today, is go out to your grocery store and buy yourself a fruit or vegetable to eat. Keeping that concentration when you're buying things, that you're buying whole grains whenever possible, whether that's in breads or pastas, using whole grain, the brown rices, things like that. Eating fish regularly, and if you're not eating fish, as I say, eating those foods that are fortified with the omega-3 fatty acids, and avoiding highly processed foods. They generally tend not to have very many nutrients, and they also tend to be very high in salt, and we're trying to keep our sodium intakes low. So I think it's really kind of trying to make that back to a more whole grain, fruit and vegetable diet is what we're having to make the movement for, but understanding that optimistically that these practices will provide your brain with its needed nutrients, so that that transition is beneficial. And I think what we're starting to see occurring at this point is that while we kind of used to have the nutrition recommendations, set up in terms of saying eat so many servings of, fruits and vegetables and grains and protein, that we're starting to see a movement away from that. And a part of it is it was just very complicated. I mean, people would come and say, if I have a whole banana, is that a one fruit or two fruits? If it's a big banana, does it count for two? It just wasn't working. And so we've seen both in the US and Canada really trying to make very simple ways in terms of looking at what do people need to do in order to be able to determine whether or not their diet is likely a healthy one. Simple principles. At least half your plate should be fruit and vegetable. And Canada is saying that you should have at least 2 different kinds. Potatoes does not count as a vegetable here. That it would fall into the grains and starches, where we're saying that whatever you're having in here should be around 1/4 of your plate, and making that whole grain at least 3 times a week, and that your meat or meat alternatives should be a little less than 1/4 of that. So very simple. What is it telling us? We need to put more fruit and vegetables on our plate, and that as much as possible, particularly for women, is to make certain that we're getting our dairy, or if not, that we're getting sources of calcium somewhere else in our diet, having more to do with our bone health than with brain health. Oops, so I seem to be stuck. Just give me a second here. Oops. I'm not sure what's, just give me, sorry, I'm not progressing here in my talk. So I'm gonna,
Carol, I noticed your taskbar came up. Oh, you might be okay now.
Yeah, okay, let me,
There you go.
oh, thank you. So I'm gonna put this back into, hopefully, what I can call the bigger picture. And a lot of that is obviously, I've been saying, we really need to go back to, you know, sort of more of a plant-based diet. That doesn't mean that we can't have meat. Certainly relying on poultry and fish is a very healthy way to do it. But I think it's also important to recognize that it's the collective of our lifestyle that's important. And where that I'm saying that from is that we know that lifestyle characteristics do tend to cluster. So in general, people that are more educated, more financially able to meet their needs tend to be the people that are more physically active, they're more socially engaged, they're having higher quality diets. So they're doing, as we go back and remembering, we were saying there's a collective of things that we can do in terms of supporting our brain function. That the people that are able to do that generally tend to be the people that are have higher levels of education and more discretionary money. And that we also generally tend to know then that individuals that have one negative lifestyle characteristic, and here I'm just putting smoking as an example, are more likely to have several. Where that's important is I think that we're starting to understand that these different aspects of lifestyle interact with one another. So here's a study that we had done where we were looking at measures of cognitive function in a group of older participants that were living in Quebec. These individuals came into our studies starting at 65 through to 79 years of age. And we have been looking at their cognitive performance on an annual level. And so what we have here on this scale is their annual change, and we're using a hybrid of the mini mental state examination that we were looking at before, and that we can see that over time, most individuals will show some loss in terms of cognitive function. This is what we anticipate in individuals with aging. But we were really interested in terms of looking at whether or not high sodium intakes would accelerate or speed this rate of cognitive decline. And our thoughts were that because we knew that hypertension or high blood pressure was a risk factor for cognitive decline, that we would anticipate that people that had high sodium intakes would be more likely to have high blood pressure and would be showing greater rates of cognitive decline. Well, that's exactly what we saw, except that when we looked at individuals based on their level of physical activity, we saw a huge relationship, so that those people that were sedentary were showing tremendously greater decline if they had a high sodium intake. But the impact of sodium on rate of cognitive decline, we didn't see any association in individuals that had higher levels of physical activity. So if we try to kind of conceptualize that, I think what it's telling us is that if individuals are physically active and they're using their physical activity to help support the health of their blood vessels, they may be able to tolerate higher levels of salt in their diet. But people that are sedentary and have high salt intake, their blood vessels are really getting a double hit, and that may be contributing in terms of their loss of cognitive function. And I would argue that we know that individual. We're talking about common human behaviors where individuals that are less physically active are probably also less attuned to the health of their diet, and that what we're going to start to see is sort of all of these adverse effects starting to multiply one on top of the other in terms of accelerating cognitive loss. Or in reverse, really what it's saying is as we make lifestyle changes, it's really important that we obviously do it across diet, but we look in terms of benefits of being more physically active, benefits of getting out, keeping yourself socially engaged, doing things that are going to keep yourself cognitively stimulated, because we want to give the brain as much, sort of benefit across all of these different lifestyle factors as we possibly can. So just kind of in a closing in terms of what I talk about some sort of things that are my little tricks throughout the day. And a lot of this comes from early studies that were done many years ago where we were, the community, scientific community, was interested in terms of looking at glucose or carbohydrate intake. We know that the brain predominantly uses glucose as its major fuel. And that here is just a paragraph recall test. It's one common tests that are used by psychologists. We tell you a story and then we ask you after a period of time to give us as much detail that you're remembering from that particular story. And here they were comparing young adults, and I must say I did not call a 58-year-old a senior. This was done by the authors, but comparing it to seniors. And what you can see is that one is that just normally as we age, we have poor performance on these types of tests, but that in older adults, we get a huge boost in performance if we're looking at testing after people have had some glucose to drink. We were interested in terms of taking this into more of a realistic kind of perspective, so that we were comparing people that they came in, did the test for us twice. One day, everybody came in fasting. One day, they stayed fasting, and on the second day, they ate breakfast before they performed the tasks. This delayed recall, this memory processing point of it, you can see in both men and women, there is a tremendous boost in activity associated with breakfast consumption. So I don't know why we lose that focus in terms of the benefit of breakfast in older adults. So we're all very attuned to making sure that our children are going off to school with breakfast so that it'll enable their learning. And we seem to forget that as we age, that our brain still needs to have that fast broken, and that we can see huge benefits in terms of cognitive performance associated with consumption of breakfast. And in this particular, so we ran two studies. One study, the breakfast was a small bowl of cereal with milk, and in the other, it was a small glass of juice with a bagel. So not talking about anything that's not easy to consume. The other piece, and I'm not certain how much people are kind of aware, is some work that was really started by a colleague of mine here at the Rotman, and she's very interested in just in terms of how our what we call circadian rhythms, or those 24-hour rhythms, change sort of naturally with the aging process. And I jokingly say that when I was in my 20s, if I was seeing the sunrise, it was because I had been out for a long party and I was just going home. And now that I'm in my 60s, as I'm seeing the sunrise, it's generally my first cup of coffee in the morning after a good night's sleep. And that type of shifting of our circadian biorhythms is a very natural process that happens, that in general, when we're young, we're more alert later in the afternoon, and as we age, we become more alert first thing in the morning. What's interesting then is that if we look in terms of our cognitive function, it's not surprising that our cognitive function is best at periods of time during the day when we're more alert. And so if you look in terms of comparing younger and older adults, that in the morning, the older adult is actually at their highest level of cognitive function relative to the afternoon, whereas we're saying the younger adult is performing better in the afternoon relative to the morning. So we see very little difference between young and old adults early in the morning, and a tremendous difference later in the afternoon. So really, I think there's a piece of the message here in terms of saying that as we age, it's really important that if we are going to be participating in tasks that are very demanding from a cognitive perspective, as much as we can, we should be scheduling those tasks in the morning. And I will say that some of these differences in terms of the circadian shifts that are going to happen, a piece of them are just a normal part of aging, but we see it even greater shifts against the context of various forms of dementia. So recognizing when you're most alert, when you're having your best cognitive function, your best cognitive activity throughout the day, and scheduling your demanding tasks around that is a really important piece. Nevertheless, we're not always that able to control our days to the same extent that we can. So here's a little study that we had done with some older adults, and we actually tested them both in the morning or in the afternoon, and the same as before. So these people came in for us for 4 different times. They either had a placebo drink, so a blank, or we gave them glucose. And that what we can see is in the afternoon, when their performance was lower, is they got the most robust benefit associated with the glucose consumption, so that it was natural for them to experience about a 40% decline in their cognitive function throughout the day, and we could cut that down to a half by simply having them consume carbohydrate. So the translation of this is that if you're in an event and you're having to perform later in the afternoon, and I know as we were waiting to start the webinar, people were talking about giving talks at conferences. I don't know if you have afternoon or morning sessions, but if you're in an afternoon session, it's really important that one is that you have your lunch and that maybe you have a very small snack about half an hour before you give your talk, because this way you're making certain that your blood glucose levels are high enough that you're feeding the brain during a period of time where you may be just very naturally slumping. So I think as we back off in terms of the final story, I'm wanting to say that there are many different ways that we can eat healthily, that a Mediterranean style diet is a diet that is based on plant foods, and it does embrace different tastes and textures from different cultures, and that all cultures have unhealthy foods, and of course had to put in the Canadian poutine here as one example. So hopefully it wasn't too much of a mouthful, that the message is very simple, moving back to more fruits and vegetables, whole grains, reducing the amount of red meat that you're consuming, more fish, more poultry, and staying away from the highly processed foods so that you're minimizing your salt intake is really what you need to be doing from a diet perspective. But that it's really important that as you start to make lifestyle changes around your diet, that you make sure that you're looking at all aspects of your lifestyle, keeping yourself cognitively engaged as you are by participating in these types of webinars, walking as much as you can so that you're getting some physical activity, making sure that you're meeting friends and having social connections, that there are a number of different things. All of these collectively stimulate the brain. The more we stimulate the brain, the better it is that we are able to maintain function for as long as possible. So with that, I'll stop and be more than delighted to answer any questions that people may have. So I'll... stop my share.
Thank you, Carol. Okay, switch back here to gallery view. Well, I got to tell you, thank you first. And the chat box has been lit up. So there are a ton of questions. And there are a few issues that I'd like to, just from notes that I took from your presentation and that came up in the chat box. But mainly, I wanted to just highlight the fact that there were a few people who, I'm just trying to find the source of that feedback here. Okay. Whoops. There were a few people who were really wondering about the, I don't want to say the importance of diet, that maybe there's an overemphasis on diet as a cause of dementia. And one person early on in your presentation said that dementia is no more prevalent in our fat country than other less fat-eating societies, and that the disease is across all peoples, as the Alzheimer's Association says. It's not just one culture, you know, in the States or in Canada, and both countries are very multicultural. And that by saying that, okay, I'm oversimplifying it a bit, but by saying that everybody with dementia eats poorly, is undereducated, is obese, you know, et cetera, is kind of like saying that all smokers will get lung cancer, or lung cancer is due, and there's a big stigma with that, that I've heard about.
Right. No. And I think that's not the message that I'm wanting to give, nor is it the right interpretation. And I think it's, I mean, if you come back to the smoking decision, we know that not all smokers will develop lung cancer, and that many non-smokers will develop lung cancer. So it comes to this idea of risk. So it's really trying to empower people in terms of saying that our lifestyle is important, and that there are things that we can do to help lower our risk. That absolutely does not mean that you're pointing a finger at individuals who may have developed the disease and said that they're responsible for it. I don't mean that at all. But looking in terms of saying there are things that we can do to stimulate our brain, that the earlier we do it, the better our brain is going to age. And that even if we are, you know, sort of older adults, and we already have disease diagnosis, that the fact that we can stimulate our brain through lifestyle, and that we know that that's going to help us retain our cognitive function, is really the piece of the message that I'm trying to get across. I'm not pointing fingers in terms of saying that anyone out there has developed a disorder because they haven't attended their lifestyle.
Okay. So before I don't want to monopolize this and go down my list of questions, but so I want to know if anybody out there has questions for Carol now. And I think we can try this in two ways. You can either type it into the chat box, and if Carol doesn't see it, then I'll highlight the question to her. I'll just moderate that. Or most of you are muted, and I've simply done that just to cut down on the video, the audio feedback. But if you want to unmute yourself or flag me down and say, hi, I want to ask a question, and you want to do that verbally, then let me know. So I'm sure that there's lots of questions. If I don't get a question, I have some other questions ready, reflected from what people have been typing in the chat box. So, but you guys first.
I was taking a medical food supplement called Exana, and it's supposed to be similar in reaction to coconut oil.
Yeah.
I have frontal temporal dementia, and I did notice a difference. It was cost prohibitive to take it because insurance didn't cover it. What are your thoughts on the coconut oil and the Exona? And
I think what we are getting is fairly, you know, early studies on the Exona that actually are encouraging. But I think the problem that you're talking about is the brutal reality is that it's prohibitive in terms of cost, and it's also very difficult to obtain in Canada. I know some of my colleagues are trying to look at a similar type of product to Exona and getting it, they have it now licensed to use in research studies in Canada. That does not translate well in terms of looking at people taking coconut oil in their diet. And I think that's where the communication in terms of the public has really gone wrong. Simply having a little bit of coconut oil in your diet is not going to create the type of metabolism that the Exona is trying to do. So trying to translate it is very difficult. So I don't support the move towards coconut oil. If you're able to access the Exona and afford it, the studies are certainly beneficial now. Most of them have been done in the context of Alzheimer's disease and not in frontal temporal dementia. So we don't know if the benefit is specific to one form of dementia or another. And then in the meantime, if you're wanting to push that envelope at all in terms of making what they call ketone bodies, which is really what Exona is forcing your body to make, you're better to be trying to do that by moving over more onto a Atkins type of a diet, which is extremely low in carbohydrates, rather than using the coconut oil, because that is going to be a better way to force yourself to make those ketone bodies.
And is that a high protein diet?
Yeah, high protein diet.
Okay.
Yeah. But arguing then that what you're wanting to balance is the high protein diet, but in a way that your blood cholesterol levels don't go up. So you're better to, sort of still keep to the healthier proteins like the fishes and the poultries and things like that for your protein intake.
Okay. Thank you.
I would argue, as much as possible, fill that out with fruits and vegetables. Even if you're always on those diets allowed some carbohydrate, and make sure that your fruits and vegetables are where you're getting your carbohydrate from.
I'm going to come back to that major sources. Sue, I see you. I've got two other questions before, okay, and then we'll get you in the line. Okay, I've had a couple of questions about the role of flour in that, so that's interesting that you bring up the carbohydrates. But before that, we have a question from Richard about, he says that there are a couple of products on the market that claim to be nutraceuticals. I don't know if I'm saying that properly, but what do you think of them?
Well, as I was saying, at this point in time, everyone falls into that global perspective where we have no clinical trials that show positive effects associated with them. So we're always going to be in the situation where you've got new ones being developed and they're, undergoing testing, and even in the scientific community, we don't have results. But at this point in time, we have no evidence for a benefit of any supplement whatsoever.
Okay. So yeah, we've had a few questions about flours, not flours, so flour, whole grain, including whole grain flour, in causing inflammation in the brain, and also the role of gluten. There's people who have gone off of flour, grain here. So
this has kind of come from a craze in terms of gluten consumption. So I think if we want to back off from that one, is really to acknowledge that there are some people who are terribly allergic to gluten, and that those people should not consume gluten at all. There's no question. Often, you know, genetically born with it, they've known all their life that they have to avoid gluten. And then there's probably up to about 10% of individuals that have what we call the gluten sensitivity, and that these individuals would have, you know, more likely to feel bloated or have diarrhea if they had sat down to a large, you know, pasta meal or bread or something like that. And those individuals should also probably keep away from gluten. For the 90% of the remainder of the population, we have no evidence whatsoever that gluten is doing any harm. And that, you know, kind of there has been unsubstantiated comments saying that consuming gluten leads to higher levels of inflammation. It is true that in those people that are allergic to gluten, that they have higher levels of inflammation, the same way that if you're allergic to strawberries and you eat a strawberry, you're going to have an inflammatory response to it. But we have no evidence whatsoever that gluten consumption in non-allergic people heightens inflammation. And if anything, the evidence is arguing that people that increase their intake of whole grains actually show lower levels of inflammation. So that we have no evidence that gluten is associated with dementia. We have no evidence in people that are not allergic to gluten that it's going to increase inflammation. We have evidence from studies like the Mediterranean style, the PrediMed that I was talking about, that as you increase your whole grains, increase your fruits and vegetables, that's what we need to do to lower inflammation.
Any reaction from the audience? I'll just give it a second. One person said that they've gone to the paleo diet, which is basically cuts out all processed foods.
Yes, and so and I think at one point I noticed something on the screen quickly in terms of the zone diet. So you know, it's you know, cutting out all processed foods, of course, we're going to say is beneficial. You're, you know, going to get more fibers. You're going to stay away from the salts that are used as preservatives in terms of processing. I'll come from the perspective in terms of saying there are many, many, many ways that we can eat healthily. For some people, it's easier to follow a prefixed diet. So whether you want the South Beach or the Zone or the Paleo, if all of that's helping you by knowing that you're, you know, kind of, you have a menu plan that's already made out from you, for you, and you're eating your fruits and vegetables and healthy protein, that's one way to do it. Other people don't want that level of restriction, and they want to be able to go into the grocery store and say, you know, tomatoes look good today and the grapes look good tomorrow, and have more freedom. So I'm not a person who likes to say that there's a single solution for everybody. What each of us needs to do is figure out how we need to support healthy food selection in ourselves, and that what enables that in each and every one of us is the right thing for us to be doing.
Okay. Sue, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you. My question is about money. I do live in an area where we have lots of nice markets that I can go and buy fresh things and fresh salmon. A lot of people don't. They live in cities too. But increasingly, organic things or things that the non-gluten and the fresh vegetables, the prices are going up and up and up, part by weather and part by our destruction of our farmland.
Yeah.
And I don't see in the future that that's going to stop going up. And I know that with some of the people that I talk with, especially in the States, they can't afford this kind of diet.
I know.
It's an expensive diet.
Well, I think it's, there's a couple of things that I think have not been well communicated, and and I certainly am very conscious of the fact that we all have differing amounts of money that we can, put towards our food choices. One is that frozen fruits and vegetables have the same nutrition quality as fresh fruits and vegetables. So there's no question that if I go into the grocery store and I have more money, I would rather buy fresh because I like the crunch and the texture more than I prefer frozen. But I am not doing anything to harm my nutrition by buying frozen vegetables, which are much more affordable. I also don't need the high-end imported vegetables, kind of going after the corns and the beans and the carrots and the peas and all of those types of things. So we've kind of given across a message to individuals that can't afford the luxury fruits and vegetables that they're not feeding themselves healthily, and that could not be further from the truth. So run down your frozen aisle, buy your fruits and vegetables there, and if you find them, that you don't like the texture, put them in the blender and have yourself a vegetable soup. And the same story really goes for the fish. That, yes, it's true that a fillet of salmon is lovely. There's nothing wrong with having a can of salmon. There's nothing wrong, sardines, I actually grew up on sardines and toast as a child, so it's always been something that I've loved. And it was canned sardines, and you can still buy a can of sardines for very little money, and it's got lots of good fish oil in it. So, how do we move back and say that you don't have to be, in the upper 5% of the population in terms of finances in order to be able to feed yourself healthily? That it's just making wise choices. Canned fish is fine. Frozen fruits and vegetables is good. It doesn't cost us more to buy brown rice than to buy white rice. So you can be making these choices even if you're struggling in terms of how much discretionary income you have.
Is organic overrated?
My personal is yes. People think that organic has more nutrients, and that's just not the truth. A peach is a peach and a tomato is a tomato. In the long run, if you have the discretionary income and you want to stay away from the pesticides, yes, it's probably something that many people will choose to do. But I don't think at this point in time that we have the evidence to say that, that the food supply that we've had, where we did have the tradition in terms of using pesticides and herbicides, has been any problem from a human health perspective.
Okay, that's interesting. No correlation that you can find then between pesticides and Alzheimer's disease?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Okay. Questions? It's getting close to the end of the webinar, so yeah, there's a few questions about older fixed income crowd cannot grow foods or afford organic good stuff, and it made me think about in long-term care homes the quality of the diet that is fed, because there's also the pressure to keep costs down. But you're saying canned salmon has the same nutrients as a
absolutely, and you're wanting the oils from the fish, and the oils are in the flesh, and whether you're eating it from a canned salmon or a can of sardines, which is even less, or from fresh, you're still getting the same oils, and making the same argument that you're absolutely getting the same nutrition if you're buying the frozen, fruits and vegetables as if you're eating the fresh. Frozen, actually, it captures those nutrients faster because it goes from field to frozen very quickly, whereas the fresh, you're always going to have some loss of nutrients associated with transport and sitting in our grocery stores. So I would love when our peaches come into season and we have that juiciness of, that fresh peach off the tree. But that doesn't mean that having a frozen peach that I'm doing myself any harm from a nutritional perspective.
Is that the same for fish? Because that are ground fish, or the fishes that fish that are better than others?
The well, you know, there's always been the concern of the farm versus the wild, and it is true that our farm fish probably have marginally higher levels of certain contaminants just associated with the meals that that the fish are being raised on. But even with that, it's so far below standards that Health Canada feel are harmful that we shouldn't be worried about it. I will buy fish not worried whether or not it's farmed or wild. I'll buy it because it's the fish that's in the market that looks the freshest that I want to eat. And I think that most people, you know, again, I think that's something that is overrated in terms of the of health concerns, and that it's more important to make sure you're putting fish in your diet.
Okay. So to close off, a number of our participants today have already been diagnosed with dementia or are experiencing issues with cognitive issues or perhaps MCI. What advice would you have for them in terms of diet for our participants today?
Well, and I think it comes back to what I was saying is you know, that the brain needs healthy nutrition in order to be able to function, that we retain our cognitive function as best as possible. And I don't care whether that's in a healthy person or a person with dementia, by going back to the principles of lots of fruits and vegetables, you know, making certain that you're getting your fish, going onto the whole grains, and avoiding the processed foods and the meat. So keeping those principles of a healthy diet. And then that last piece that I was saying in terms of not to skip meals. It's really important that we're constantly feeding the brain. So make certain that you have breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And that you're not wanting to miss out on that. And it's also, I think the final is saying that, you know, the extreme in terms of dementia of what we call sundowning, where people are finding it harder and harder to function later in the day, is probably the extreme of what I was saying in terms of we have these peaks and valleys in terms of our cognitive function. Saying take advantage of those peaks if you can control your schedule when you're doing things. But if you're having to be in a valley, then, you know, give yourself something to eat before you engage in those activities so that you're doing what you can in terms of boosting your cognitive performance.
Actually, I lied. I had one other question. And that you're focusing on the Mediterranean diet. And you made a point that just because a country happens to be in the Mediterranean doesn't mean that their diet is high quality. And I've heard that even Italians and that are starting to drift away more towards a North American style diet. Right. But are there countries where there is a lesser, the rate of Alzheimer's or other dementias is lower, and they kind of think that might be attributed to diet?
Well, I mean, I suppose to a certain extent, you know, kind of where you've got some of the strongest arguments in terms of lifestyle perspective come out of Japan, although they certainly have problems in terms of high salt. But in the Japanese, it's culture, it's probably, and particularly in those small remote islands where there's many centenarians and lower rates of dementia, it's also, there's a very active culture in terms of social engagement. Seniors are respected, you know, so it's hard to kind of just pull it apart in terms of any one of those lifestyle attributes that are there. But Japan is definitely a hot spot where people try to get a sense of what's going on from that perspective. And there are other hot spots, but I think it's also, you know, we can look at something like going out for Chinese food, and we know that we can make unhealthy selections from a Chinese food menu and end up with, you know, deep fried chicken and egg rolls and all of those types of things, or we can have a nice stir fry with fruits and vegetables. So it's really moving back and forth from my perspective in terms of recognizing that there's good in every culture, and that we just have to learn how to select the good.
Okay. Any other questions? Anybody, you can just wave if you want. And oh, wait a minute. I think I see a wave here. Alva? Yeah, hi, Alva. You were behind my chat box. I can just like this.
Yeah, I was just interested in, isn't there a lower incidence of dementia in India that is possibly attributed to turmeric or curry, curcumin?
Right.
Have you done any studies on that?
You know, I've really tried to track down the curcumin story. So I think so to me that kind of falls into the perspective in terms of trying to find these bioactive ingredients in food. And at the end of the day, the brutal reality is that while it is absolutely true that turmeric is very rich in this compound that's an antioxidant called curcumin, the turmeric is only a portion of curry, and we only put teaspoons a day of curry into our meal against the context of eating you know, plates of food. So the amount of curcumin that you would get in your diet associated with eating curry is going to be extremely small relative to the high levels of antioxidants that are in fruits and vegetables. That there has not been a lot of studies, and I think it was about 6 months ago that I went back and specifically tried to get at the epidemiology again, that has been able to attribute lower dementia risk associated with curry consumption. There was one that was coming out of Malaysia, I believe, where some of the Malaysian food is also curry-based, that was pointing towards a protective effect of curries. But I just don't know whether or not we're talking about completely different diets from a Malaysian perspective in terms of whether or not they're curry-based or not. So I think we really have to be careful. And you know, I would rather see people getting their bang from their food buck by picking up fruits and vegetables and making certain that they're loading up their plate with plant-based foods than being worried about the quarter of a teaspoon of turmeric or coriander or whatever that they may be trying to flavor their food. And if you're using those herbs and spices, don't use them because of their antioxidants. Use them because you like what they're doing to the flavor of fruits and vegetables, and it's helping you eat more of them.
Mm-hmm. What I did was I bought the root turmeric raw, and I've been adding it to the smoothie that I make every morning in my NutriBullet with whole vegetables.
Yeah, and, I mean, I guess I would come from the argument that the whole vegetables are probably where I would see the focus. You're certainly not doing yourself any harm by putting the, you know, sort of the turmeric in, and people are looking at, you know, some of the other spices that are commonly used in curry blends, things like the cardamom, but so, you know, is there an interest in, you know, all of those pungent flavors, whether it's coming from tea or from spices or herbs, those pungent flavors are often compounds that are antioxidants. So most things that you think of that are very pungent are going to be very high in antioxidant, and we can get it from a lot of different ways. So, you know, you may like the flavor of the turmeric in your smoothie. Other people would want to go on other pungent flavors, and so I think we have to have this room for people to be able to work with their own palates in terms of how to be able to give themselves something that's healthy.
Interesting. Well, Carol's cookbook, Mindful. I think perhaps one thing you could do is get this book, even from your library. That's where I first got it. And find some good recipes, and invite some of your friends over for dinner, and socialize as well. I couldn't help but think that the countries that you're speaking about, the cultures, are all very social, very family-oriented, very social, very community-oriented as well. And I wonder how much that plays into it, and how much is a coincidence. But this book is available on Amazon, and just making recipes out of this book without even thinking about how many vegetables you're eating per day and how many servings of fish I think it'll just kind of help you to see what a healthier diet looks like, what it can look like, just by making some of these recipes. And we use the granola one now. We like that one all the time. So thank you so much, Carol. Would it be okay if we used if I got a copy of your slides and put them on our website? We've had some requests.
Yep.
Okay, great. So I'll get them from you. Terrific.
I have your email address.
Okay. Okay, thank you everybody for coming today, and a round of applause for our guest here. Thank you so much. And we will see you next month.
You have to unmute us for us to give the pause.
Wait, yeah, sure. Okay. Unmute. Oh,
Yeah.
here we go. Okay.
I'm going to eat.
Here we go.
Because I have to perform this afternoon.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah, everybody have a snack before the DAI board meeting, okay?
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Please, some practical advice for you.